The new Defence Production Action Plan will help us build a robust and resilient defence sector, not only to develop the munitions and hardware needed to support Ukraine's war efforts, but to strengthen our own defence capabilities. I also welcome the announcement that G7 members will provide wide-ranging and long-term security commitments with Ukraine. This is a crucial signal to Putin and those that back him that our support for Ukraine will not waver. We must continue to show that his illegal invasion will end in defeat and that it will only make NATO a stronger alliance. And that's why this House should celebrate the historic decision by NATO nations to welcome Sweden into the alliance. Yeah. Sweden will be a strong addition to NATO, and their membership, along with the recent accession of Finland, shows once again that rather than divide and weaken Europe, Putin's war has only strengthened our collective resolve. NATO has never been stronger. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I understand the decision by leaders not to set a timetable for Ukraine's membership of NATO. But I also support the clear declaration that Ukraine's future lies within the alliance. Our military assistance for Ukraine has Labour's total backing, but so too does Ukraine's long-term aims to join NATO. They fight on the front line of European freedom. So it's important that we are clear to the people of Ukraine who fight so bravely for their future. The question is not if Ukraine joins NATO, but when Ukraine joins NATO. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, finally, it's important we are clear that even if there's a change of government in the UK, there will never be a change in Britain's resolve, no change in our support for Ukraine, no change in our commitment to the security of Britain and our allies. And at moments like this House tends to acknowledge this unity, understand that our words carry weight beyond these shores. We choose them wisely. So I would ask the Prime Minister, when he rises, whether he's prepared to correct the record in this House in relation to a social media statement he made last night that Labour didn't want him to attend the summit this week. On the contrary, we were delighted that he was there, because in an ever more dangerous world, we must be united. And NATO must be coordinated, ready to adapt and ready to strengthen. The decisions taken this week give us a platform to do that and deliver a plan that can protect our collective security and support our friends in need, however difficult that may prove to be. We must stay the course and make sure Putin's brutal ambition ends in his total defeat. Yeah. Thank you, Mr.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman, although I would say it's a bit rich to attack me for missing Prime Minister's question time and then say that you don't want me to attend the NATO summit. You simply can't.
Please, I want to hear the Prime Minister. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the point has been made. And I welcome the right honourable gentleman's, I think, newfound affection for the NATO alliance, having sat for long years, having sat for long years next to someone who wanted to.
I want to hear the Prime Minister. Those who don't, please, they can leave now. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think you can just tell from the volume of noise. They don't like it, Mr. Speaker, but it's the truth. They all.
Order. And it's the same for this side. I also want to hear him. I don't want this side stopping me either, Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reality is this. For long years, the honourable gentleman did sit there next to someone who didn't support NATO, who wanted to scrap Trident and abolish our armed forces. So that's what the record is. But I am pleased that he does join the government in supporting efforts for Ukraine. It is important that that remains a united position across this House.
The Chief Whip. That doesn't mean to say he carries on shouting like he does here, Prime Minister.
With regard briefly to NATO membership, I think it's important that President Zelensky's words are listened to. And as he said, he viewed the NATO summit as providing a meaningful success for Ukraine, for his country and its people, because significant progress was made on the path towards NATO membership. It is a question of when, not if, and as the Secretary-General said, what was a two-step process has now become a one-step process with more political and political support and momentum for Ukraine's membership than at any time in NATO's history. That's something that President Zelensky understands and appreciates. And over the course of the 2 days, what's crystal clear is that there is an incredibly strong feeling amongst all alliance members to support Ukraine on that journey as quick as practically possible.
Sir Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the statement from the Prime Minister. I returned from Ukraine in the last few days, where I was quite close to the front line working with the charity. And the one thing that I must tell him is that they are enormously grateful for the leadership that he has shown and the UK has shown within NATO. They never stop telling us how much they welcome the UK's leadership in this matter. Can I also say that while I was there, they were very clear that in their assaults, their biggest problem is they are losing many men trying to clear the minefields. They do not have the right equipment. In fact, at night, they go forward with bayonets trying to get to the mines. It's shocking to see. So can I urge my right honourable friend, if at all possible, could we make it a priority to talk to the US government and try and get them to release the right equipment that would allow them to make this assault in the right way and not lose so many lives?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for all his commitment and indeed his personal visits to Ukraine to see firsthand what is happening and how best we can tailor our support. He's right about the mines that have been left by the Russian armies. It is a considerable effort to have them cleared. I want to reassure him that we are in close communication with the Ukrainian military about exactly what capabilities and equipment they need to clear minefields and support their armed forces as they make progress. We will continue to have that conversation and work with allies to get them all the kit that they need.
SNP spokesperson Deirdre Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with the Prime Minister and the shadow opposition leaders' strong support for Ukraine, Slav Ukraini. This government's defence command paper will be published next week, I believe. Given events in Ukraine, what lessons has the Ministry of Defence learned about modern urban warfare and how that will feed into operational strategy? I recall the former Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee just before the war saying we have to recognise that the old concepts of fighting big tank battles on European landmass are over. He then proceeded to cut our tank numbers. How wrong he was. Is this department considering future opportunities for defence cooperation with the EU that are complementary to NATO? There is less than a week left, this is very important, so I hope the Prime Minister is listening, until the expiration of the deal allowing Ukrainian grain exports via the Black Sea. Can the Prime Minister speak to the discussions that were had at the summit to ensure the continuation of the current deal that is vital for Ukraine's remaining economy and global food security? What steps has the department taken and will take to improve the UK's military partnership with Finland in the period since Finland joined NATO, and are there plans to do the same with Sweden? Given recent reports of Russian spying on and sabotage of energy infrastructure in the North Sea, and the fact that the UK's undersea cables are worth £7.4 trillion a day to the economy, what will the UK be contributing to NATO's establishment of its critical undersea infrastructure coordination cell, and will it be based in Scotland? And my honourable friend and leader, the member for Aberdeen South, raised with the Prime Minister previously that some nations are continuing to use products from Russian oil. Did he pursue this further? Is it his impression there is genuine unity on proposed reconstruction efforts in Ukraine? And finally, how does this Prime Minister hope to contribute to diplomatic efforts to bring on board parts of the international community, increasingly on the Republican right in America, to support what NATO is doing to ensure Ukraine's survival?
Mr. Speaker, with regard to NATO cooperation with the EU, I agree wholeheartedly with the Secretary-General, who set three very clear conditions for supporting EU defence initiatives. Firstly, that they are coherent with NATO requirements. Secondly, that they develop capabilities that are available to NATO. And lastly, that they are open to the fullest participation of non-EU NATO allies. That's been the established position. It's one that we fully support. With regard to I think she asked about the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is due to expire on the 17th of July. I commend President Erdogan's leadership on this issue. In particular, over the last year, I spoke to him at the conference and last week on this. He's working to engage with the Russians on extending the grain deal, as are other allies. It's important that the grain deal is extended because, as we know, around 2/3 of the grain leaving Ukraine is destined for low and middle income countries, and we don't want Russia to inflict any more suffering than it already is. And thirdly, she asked about undersea cables and undersea infrastructure. I agree with her, that's something that requires attention and focus, which is why the Ministry of Defence and DCIT are working collaboratively together with industry to make sure that everyone is doing their part to protect what is critical infrastructure. The MOD is developing particular capabilities to monitor and protect that infrastructure, and it's something that we have put on the agenda through JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which obviously comprises of the Northern European nations, and we are hosting, in fact, as I think she alluded to, potential headquarters for more focus on that area, and it's something that I look forward to discussing with my JEF allies towards the end of this year. And lastly, in terms of galvanizing international support for Ukraine, that is something that I do when I am at these international summits, particularly when I was last in the US. One of the things I did do is spend half a day in Congress talking to congressional leaders on both parties to illustrate to them the importance of providing support to Ukraine, not just now, but for years into the future. I'm delighted that the US has played a leading role in the multilateral security guarantees, and it's important that they do so. But as we're seeing, we are broadening the coalition of support for Ukraine, and being at these international summits, talking to world leaders, it shows that the UK is leading by example and leading from the front, and I was very pleased that France has just announced that it will also now be providing long-range weapons to Ukraine, following the UK's lead and making an enormous difference to Ukraine's counter-offensive.
Francois.
Thank you, sir. In terms of Britain's contribution, had our excellent Defence Secretary Ben Wallace not effectively foreseen the Russian invasion and provided thousands of NLAWs to the Ukrainians with the appropriate training to blunt the assault, Russian generals would be having lunch in Kyiv today. The British Army, relative to its size, has made a larger contribution in terms of critical equipment, its key organs, if you like, than any other army in NATO, including the United States. We can be immensely proud of that, but those organs need to be grown back for our own security and to maintain our contribution to NATO. So will the PM do everything he can, and critically, to provide the resources to do it?
Yeah, very good. I agree wholeheartedly with my honourable friend that this House and the entire country can and should be proud of the leadership we've shown on Ukraine. And he's right that, particularly with regard to stockpiles, we need to rebuild the stockpiles that we have provided. That's why in the budget, £5 billion extra funding was provided for the armed forces, with a large chunk of that going particularly to rebuild those organs and those stockpiles, coming on top of the £500 million that was provided in the autumn statement. And just this week we announced a new contract, for example, with BAE to provide critical 155 rounds, which he'll be familiar with, are absolutely mission critical. And because we now have the funding to provide long-term contracts, we can increase defence production. That's good for our security, it's good for the security of our allies, and crucially, it also creates jobs, particularly in the north of England.
Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's update and our support for Ukraine. I strongly agree with him that we need to encourage our allies in NATO to meet their NATO commitments in full. But how is he encouraging that goal when he is overseeing a cut to the British Army of 10,000 troops? Isn't one of the key lessons from Russia's attack on Ukraine that a sizable standing army remains crucial to the defence and security of our country and of NATO allies? So will he listen to voices across this House calling for reversal to cuts in army numbers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we talked about defence spending. It is clear that not just have we met the 2% target, we were one of the first to do so. We've done so for over a decade, and it's good that others are now catching up with that, and our leadership on this issue is unquestionable. But also in terms of how that money is spent, ultimately that is a question for our military chiefs to make sure that we have the optimal mix of capabilities to protect ourselves against the threats that we face. I'm not going to preempt the Defence Command Paper, other than to say when it comes to our armed forces, it's important that not just the quantum that we have in terms of the army, but how lethal they are and how deployable and agile they are. That has been a particular focus of attention from CGS, and it's a plan that we are putting in place. And actually, I maybe draw slightly different lessons to him from the conflict that Ukraine is currently experiencing. The capabilities that we have brought to bear have been in a range of areas, all of which have received extra investment. But again, these will be questions for the Defence Command paper, which you won't have to wait very long to see.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and indeed congratulate him for contributing to what I think history will prove to have been one of the most significant NATO summits in NATO's history. And could I ask him just to clarify what he understands the intention is with regard to Ukraine's membership of NATO? What would be the purpose of delaying Ukraine's membership of NATO beyond the end of hostilities in Ukraine and the victory for the Ukrainians? Because without the Article 5 security guarantee, rebuilding Ukraine will be much more difficult because investors will not have confidence unless we're providing that Article 5 security guarantee.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question? In the interest of time, I might point him in the direction of the Secretary-General's press conference from the day before yesterday, which I think explained in more detail than I have time for the process and how it relates to how this has been done previously. As he pointed out, it has never been a question of timing with accession to NATO. It's always been a question of conditions and circumstances, and as he will be familiar, there is an ongoing conflict, but also there are requirements on all NATO members when it comes to areas like modernisation, governance and interoperability, which now Ukraine is firmly on the path towards fulfilling, not least because of the help and support that we have provided over the past year. I also do agree with him that I think history will judge this to be one of the most significant NATO summits. There was the significant change in the defence investment pledge, so that 2% is now firmly established as a floor, not a ceiling. The most comprehensive update to NATO's warfighting plans in decades, if not since probably since the end of the Cold War, which are remarkable in their breadth and significance, and the accession of new members, Finland and Sweden to follow, and then lastly the move on membership for Ukraine. I think taken together it represents a significant set of NATO achievements sitting alongside the multilateral security guarantees. So it's been, I think, as he says, a historic and very important couple of days.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope that the Prime Minister in his reply will just help clarify that it is we who owe gratitude to Ukraine, not the other way round. But could the Prime Minister update us on plans not simply to help Ukraine win the war, but win the peace? The reconstruction of Ukraine will cost at least $400 billion, and Russia should be helping foot the bill. That means that we need new laws to seize, not simply freeze assets. It means we need action at the United Nations to change the norms around immunity of central banks. And crucially, it means that we need to start prosecuting Russia for the crime of aggression. This will require us mobilising not simply a military NATO, but an economic NATO. Could the Prime Minister update us on the conversations he's had to make that a reality?
Well, as the honourable gentleman knows, we've recently hosted the Ukraine Recovery Conference, which the Ukrainian government and people are extremely grateful for, the most successful conference of its ilk that's happened. It raised over $60 billion for Ukraine's reconstruction and mobilised private sector capital as is necessary. I think it was seen as a significant achievement, and again, the UK leading from the front. And with regard to assets, there's a good couple of paragraphs I point him to in the NATO communique. All allies are taking steps, as are we, to legally freeze assets until suitable reparations have been put in place for reconstruction from Russia. He'll understand the international legal framework for doing so is untested and novel, requires cooperation amongst allies, and that cooperation and work is happening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And further to the question from the member for Birmingham Hodge Hill, I do welcome the UK's strong leadership at the NATO summit and thank the Prime Minister for that. And the unity and the resources and the new members send a very, very powerful message. It is not the case that there's a timetable for Ukraine's membership to NATO, but it is only a matter of time until Ukraine joins NATO. And when that time comes, the extent of reconstruction and investment needed in the country will be vast. And a lot of Russian assets are held here and are frozen. So could the Prime Minister elaborate even further on the conversations he had at the summit in terms of how the UK will play, again, a leadership role in unlocking resources from those Russian assets to help with the reconstruction of Ukraine?
I thank the Honourable Lady. So we've recently published new legislation enabling sanctions on Russia to be maintained until Moscow pays compensation to Ukraine, and I can assure her that we will pursue all lawful routes to ensure that Russian assets are made available in support of Ukraine's reconstruction in line with international law. Our international partners, like the UK, are yet to fully test the lawfulness of a new asset seizure regime, but that is exactly the work that we are doing with allies, particularly across the G7, to share expertise and experience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for guarantees about its security and territorial integrity. So, given what has happened since, we all understand why President Zelensky is so keen to join the alliance. Does the Prime Minister agree that when and however the current war ends, NATO membership at that point is going to need to form the cornerstone of new security guarantees that the people of Ukraine can rely upon?
Well, I think the people of Ukraine received a very strong signal of support from the NATO alliance over the past couple of days. That's indeed what President Zelensky believes and what he is taking back to his country, as he called it, a significant security victory. But also the signature of the multilateral agreement on security guarantees by the G7 represents near-term immediate support for Ukraine's security from the G7 allies, and I'm highly confident that others will join that declaration too, giving the Ukrainian people some assurance and security that they rightly deserve.
Philip Davis.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend the Prime Minister for his leading role at the NATO summit, and I very much support his statement. In that statement, it said all allies made an enduring commitment to invest at least 2% of GDP. Now, many countries have been making this promise for many years and never actually fulfilling it. They want the protection of NATO, but they're not paying their fair share towards it, instead relying on the UK taxpayer and more importantly for the US taxpayer to foot the bill. Can I ask the Prime Minister what more can be done to make sure that every country in NATO, if they want the protection of NATO, pay their fair share?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. I agree wholeheartedly with him, which is why we fought very hard for the new Defence Investment Pledge to set 2% as an enduring commitment and a floor, not a ceiling. I think the progress has been made. If he looks at the statistics over the last couple of years in particular, he will see an increase not just in the volume of defence spending across the alliance, but in the number of countries that are meeting 2%, which are forecast to be potentially as high as 2/3 of all members next year, which will represent a landmark achievement. But he's right, we must keep the pressure on and urge everyone to fulfil their 2% commitment.
Emma Luba.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows that UK stockpiles are being depleted due to the war in Ukraine, and for us to rightly sustain our support at the right level, the government should be fully addressing our diminished defence industrial base and skills shortages. Our NATO allies were swift to reboot their defence plans, yet he has consistently delayed the Defence Command paper. Why is that?
When she talks about what other allies are doing, again, it's not the conversation that I've been having for the last couple of days, where other allies look up to the UK for the example that we have set, Mr. Speaker. We are the ones that are increasing defence spending, and particularly to rebuild stockpiles, as I mentioned previously. £5 billion of investment at the budget, coming on top of £500 million at the autumn statement, a new contract announced just this week, and indeed that is creating jobs across the country, but particularly in the north. That's the right thing to do, and that's what we'll continue to deliver.
Andrew Snow.
What conclusions has the Prime Minister drawn about the increased vulnerability of Ukraine once it gave up its nuclear weapons and the contribution our nuclear weapons make to our own security?
Mr. Speaker, our nuclear deterrent is the ultimate guarantee of our security. That's why it's so important, not just for the UK, but also it's an important part of the contribution that we bring to NATO. We are one of the few countries that offers not just nuclear capabilities to NATO, but again, carrier strike, fifth generation combat air, and leading maritime across the board, as well as cyber offensive. That's why we're respected in NATO, and that's why we're a valuable member of the alliance.
Holly Lynch.
Mr. Speaker, I was at the forum of the Nato summit in Vilnius this week alongside my right honourable friend, the member for Durham North, who is the Vice President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I hope the Prime Minister will join me in firstly paying tribute to Lithuania for not only their political leadership but for having been such excellent hosts and organising such a historic summit. But the mood in Vilnius was not quite as the Prime Minister presents. Representatives of Ukraine's Parliament and civil society had a clear and sobering message that the longer the war goes on, they are losing brave fighters on the front line, and it's why it's so important that we get the weapons that Ukraine needs to win into the hands of those brave soldiers now. So what were the practical outcomes of what was agreed to make sure that those resources are on the front line so that Ukraine can win sooner rather than later?
So I'll just say to the Honourable Lady that is exactly what we have been doing for the last year, and the Ukrainian government and people are extremely grateful for our leadership on that issue. But I will join with her and paying tribute to Lithuania, not just for hosting excellently a summit, but for demonstrating so clearly why our collective security is so important, given their geographic position and the threats they face, particularly from Belarus. It was important that the NATO summit was there, and it sends a strong signal of our unity in supporting the eastern flank of the NATO alliance, which I think is incredibly important.
James Sutherland.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Having worked in and around NATO for several decades, I'm clear that NATO remains the exemplar for Western security. And can I also please thank the Prime Minister for his exemplary leadership when it comes to the UK contribution. Can I please ask the Prime Minister, noting that a significant number of countries are not providing their 2% commitment, does he have any sense on how these countries might be encouraged or even coerced to do so?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I'm pleased to see is positive forward momentum, and I think you can see that in, as I said, not just the quantum of defence spending across the alliance, but the number of individual countries that are increasing spending and indeed are forecast to meet the 2% target next year. It's right that we keep the pressure on, and the new defence investment pledge that was signed at this summit, I think, demonstrates a willingness across the alliance that defence spending does need to increase, a recognition of the threats that we face, but also a recognition that a number of countries, including the UK, have been leading on this issue for some years.
Gardner.
475 new military sites and 50 major new military bases have been built by Russia on its northern frontier, its northern flank, in the past 6 years. This is because of the loss of the summer sea ice exposing that flank, and it makes clear the way in which climate change is affecting and endangering all of our lives, not just in terms of the environment and food security, but militarily as well. What discussions did the Prime Minister have at the NATO summit about the Arctic Council and the way in which the balance on the Arctic Council, that has moved from 5 to 3, now 7 to 1, has furthered that isolation? Did he discuss the way in which the Northern Sea route has now been claimed by Russia as an inland sea, and that warships are now having to declare when they go through?
Well, Mr. Speaker, all I would say is one of the things that I spend a lot of my time talking about is with our JEF allies. And in particular, he will know, because of the geographic location of JEF, which we are the leading framework nation in, the security of the High North and the Arctic is something that we talk about regularly, and indeed I discussed that with some of my counterparts over the last 2 days, and it will be a focus of our discussions at the JEF summit towards the end of the year. But he should rest assured that it's an area that we pay increasing focus to, not just from an intelligence perspective, but also with our military capabilities.
So then, Paul Bell.
The Prime Minister for his tireless efforts leading from the front in NATO's support for Ukraine. The United Kingdom is NATO's largest European defence spender, spending on defence more than 20 other NATO allies combined. We are meeting our 2% commitments. Far too many others aren't. By when does the Prime Minister expect all NATO allies to have met the 2% floor?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as soon as possible is what I'd like to say, but hopefully next year we will see very significant progress in the number of countries in the alliance that are meeting their 2% target. It's forecast to be almost 2/3 next year on a rising trajectory, and as I said, it's important that we keep the pressure on. The threats that we face are only growing in their scale and complexity, and we need to invest more to protect ourselves against them.
Alison McGovern.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Prime Minister. We should be proud of the United Kingdom's place at the heart of NATO, as I have always been proud of my party's role in the creation of the alliance. So can I ask the Prime Minister to agree with me that those in the United Kingdom who know the consequences of Putin's murderous regime best, the Ukrainian, Polish and Eastern European communities ought to be supported here? And can I ask the Prime Minister to again agree with me that no one should ever try to denigrate or divide anyone else from those long-standing parts of our British community?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's in particular those countries that value the relationship they have with the UK, and the meetings that I had over the past couple of days evidence that, and I particularly pay tribute to their leadership on this issue, supporting Ukraine and setting an example when it comes to defence spending, and as that's why, in particular with Poland, we have a close and growing defence and military relationship, and they are only going to become a more significant part of the NATO alliance in the years to come.
Andrew Jones.
Mr. Speaker, and can I congratulate my right honourable friend for the leadership that he has shown in this highly successful confirmation of our ambition to reach 2.5% of spending, GDP spending on defence, and the progress being made encouraging others to do the same. But can my right honourable friend comment on how NATO is utilising new technologies to ensure that it remains at the cutting edge?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, because we do have to keep on the cutting edge of new technologies to maintain our military superiority and advantage against adversaries. The UK is playing its part in two particular ways. We'll be hosting the European headquarters of Diana, which is the Defence Innovation Accelerator, but also last year saw the announcement of a £1 billion pounds or perhaps dollars innovation fund, the first sovereign venture capital fund of its type, which will ensure that we can continue to invest in those critical technologies which provide a security advantage.
Kevin Brandon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I please, in welcoming the Prime Minister's statement, gently encourage him to adopt a slightly different tone rather than use phrases like a newfound affection for NATO, which is a phrase that he used. He knows the absolutely seminal role that was played by the post-war Labour government, and in particular the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevan, in the creation of NATO. And he also knows that Labour's policy, I suggest they read some history books, and he also knows that Labour's policy of support for NATO is as strong now as it was 75 years ago. Will he instead welcome that fact and work in a statesmanlike way with the Leader of the Opposition and in the national interest?
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't quibbling at all with the leadership shown by Labour politicians 75 years ago. I was quibbling with the one shown by them just a few years ago.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the across Watford, as across the UK, the country and people have been so welcoming of those from Ukraine who have been moved from their homes because of the despicable acts of Putin. And would he agree with me that today we're as resolved to help Ukraine win their war against Putin as we were on day one that he invaded their country?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We remain completely resolute in our commitment to support Ukraine for as long as it takes for them to regain their sovereignty and freedom, and it is enormously a proud accomplishment of this country that we've provided such warm hospitality and refuge to many Ukrainian families in all parts of our country, and I know that's something that every member of this House will join me in thanking those families for welcoming Ukrainian families to their homes, and long may it continue.
Richard Ford.
Mr. Speaker, the statements coming out of Vilnius this week make plain that Ukraine will not be admitted to NATO until it enjoys a peaceful relationship with its neighbours. That's understandable, But what is the Prime Minister doing to make plain to Russia that Russia would be mistaken if it took this as an incentive to sustain its aggression, given that Ukraine is not responsible for the war on its territory?
Just very specifically, by leading the conversation and now delivering multilateral security guarantees to Ukraine, which we first spoke about in February at the Munich Security Conference, which has been delivered at this summit by the G7 allies, and I'm sure will be joined by many others, which unequivocally demonstrate to Russia that not only is there going to be support to Ukraine today, but for years to come, and that will serve as a significant deterrent to him and hopefully change the calculus in his head about the persistence of this illegal and unprovoked war.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, particularly his commitment to leading the debate on tackling emerging security threats, including the migration crisis. I wonder if I can ask my right honourable friend if he can explain how NATO can play a stronger role in helping some of our southern allies to build capabilities and capacity in southern Europe.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The Italian Prime Minister and I spent time discussing this, and indeed she and I raised it in the NATO sessions. It's something that we agreed to work jointly on because it's clear that illegal migration is one of the new threats that we face, whether it's being weaponised by Belarus or indeed coming from Wagner-oriented action in Africa. And it's right that we as an alliance do what we can to share intelligence and strengthen our cooperation to break the cycle of criminal gangs and stop illegal migration.
I think so.
Speaker, as chair of the Ukraine APPG, I know how steadfast support for Ukraine is right across the House. Ukraine is not just defending itself, it's defending the UK and people right across Europe. So I was disappointed to hear Defence Secretary say he's not Amazon. Does the Prime Minister disassociate himself from those comments? And a year ago, the UK led international efforts to create a fund of £770 million military aid, but none has been delivered. When will that military aid arrive in Ukraine?
Great question.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine are incredibly grateful for all of the leadership and support shown by the British government and indeed the British people. And one of the things that we did was coordinate the international fund for Ukraine amongst our allies, and we continue to do that and make sure that we deliver vital supplies to the Ukrainian armed forces.
Luca.
Claire and I share a personal interest in artificial intelligence, and we've seen it used both in deep fakes for President Zelensky, which was taken down very quickly. However, AI has moved on very, very quickly, with ChatGPT being open to the public very quickly. So what conversations were had at NATO about how we deal with this? And more importantly, what can the UK do to make sure that we have a safe framework around AI?
My honourable friend is absolutely right about the opportunities and the threats posed by AI. The Defence Innovation Accelerator for Northern Alliance, Diana, that I mentioned, will particularly look at harnessing dual-use commercial technologies in areas like AI, and as I said, we'll be hosting the European headquarters. But more broadly, the UK is proud to be hosting the first global summit on AI safety later this year. Well, this will, of course, be a topic of conversation.
Dr. Rupert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour founded NATO, so of course we welcome his work. Can I ask what his thoughts are and whether the summit discussed the possibility of establishing a special tribunal to bring those responsible for the Russian Federation's illegal war to account for war crimes and crimes against humanity? It was part of the Memorandum of Understanding at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, another security alliance which we're part of. I was there the other week. It was moved by the Ukrainians, very movingly. They're full members of that alliance. I wondered what his thoughts would be on that.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, it's right that we hold Russia and those responsible to account for their war crimes in Ukraine. That's why we led a state party referral to the ICC and provided about £1 million of funding to the court. It's also why we've joined a core group of countries to explore options to ensure criminal accountability for the crime of aggression committed in and against Ukraine, including through a special tribunal. And at the European Council meeting I was at, the Council of Europe meeting, we became a founding member of the International Register of Damage caused by the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. So we'll continue to do everything we can to hold those responsible for crimes to account.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend in particular for the role that he played that led to Turkey agreeing the accession of Sweden to NATO, which really was a momentous event. Mr. Speaker, as part of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, with the Royal Navy, we've had the privilege of visiting the home of the continuous at-sea deterrent in Faslane and those support it at Northwood. Does my right honourable friend agree with me, and I think everybody on this side of the House, that our nuclear deterrent is vital to our nation and to NATO? And would he join me in thanking those who serve in silence and in secret beneath the waves?
I think my honourable friend makes an excellent point. Our submariners do an extraordinary job under difficult conditions, and they deserve our gratitude for everything that they do for our country. They are the ultimate guarantor of our security, and we owe them our thanks.
Nick Smith. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour's Ernie Bevin helped found NATO. But can I ask the Prime Minister, why has the Conservatives given us the smallest army for 300 years?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's right that our armed forces adapt their capabilities to the threats that we face. I mean, trying to compare the threats that we face and the capabilities we have now to when NATO was founded is completely ridiculous. So it's important now that we invest in whether it's offensive cyber, Mr. Speaker, or extra maritime capabilities to deal with subsea infrastructure. The range of threats we face evolves all the time, and we will continue to make sure that we're protected against them. But what no one can doubt is our commitment to investing in our armed forces. Record levels, and a 2% commitment that we first met over a decade ago, sustained and on a rising trajectory. This government is committed to investing more in our defence, and we will do so in a way that absolutely protects us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say as a Bristol MP we're incredibly proud of Ernie Bevin. He was orphaned at 8. He started work on the Bristol docks at the age of 11 and went on to become British Foreign Secretary and found NATO, which is quite some achievement. Can I ask the Prime Minister, though, obviously this is a very welcome move in terms of the containment of Russian activity and strengthening Ukraine's position, but he did mention briefly the activities of Russia's Wagner group in Africa, where there's widespread reports of atrocities being carried out, and the fact that they're using trading in natural resources, being paid in mining concessions to avoid sanctions. Can you say what action the UK is taking to try to combat that?
We're working closely with partners, particularly France and others, to share intelligence and do what we can to combat the destabilising impacts of Wagner where in different parts of the world, and we've also sanctioned the Wagner group in its entirety and indeed its leaders, which is contributing to some of the economic squeeze on them.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Earlier, the Prime Minister referred to Turkey's president. Turkey is the most important member of NATO, and in recent times, Turkey has changed its stance slightly, and we see the historic result of that change. The UK has had a long historic relationship with Turkey. Can I take it from the Prime Minister that every effort will be made through all channels, including diplomacy, to build on that relationship with Turkey and make the alliance stronger thus?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and I was pleased to be, I think, the first Western leader to call and congratulate President Erdogan after his recent election victory, but also I spoke to him last Friday and spent time with him over the past couple of days. And he's right about the role that Turkey plays in the alliance, and indeed about the closeness of our partnership and friendship with Turkey, which we are looking to find ways to strengthen and deepen, whether it's economically or on defence or indeed on illegal migration. The President and I had a very good conversation and agreed to do more in all those areas. He shares my ambition for a closer, deeper, stronger relationship.
Margaret Farley.
In a statement, NATO's Secretary-General welcomed the new partnership programme with Japan and criticised China's military advancements. What assessment has the Prime Minister made of China's response to this statement, and does he have concerns about the vague threat that any action threatening Beijing's rights will be met with a resolute response?
As was crystal clear, NATO is a defensive alliance, Mr. Speaker, and it's right that we in the UK and indeed other NATO countries strengthen their partnerships with nations in the Indo-Pacific. That's why they were invited to this NATO summit, because our security is indivisible. We have seen that, and the values that we all share are ones that we believe universally to be true, and that's why we will strengthen our personal relationships with Japan. The recent Hiroshima Accords are crystal clear on that. I think Japan would, as they did say, view the United Kingdom as their closest European ally. We strengthen not just our economic relationship, but critically our defence relationship with Japan, and of course they are a partner alongside Italy in building the next generation of our fighter aircraft.
That completes the Prime Minister's statement. I'll let the chamber clear. We now come to the business statement. I call Thangham Debona.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Leader if she'll give us the forthcoming business.